least in my experience at JGU, to have an opportunity for the significance of this theme to be addressed by the deans of the schools that are most relevant to the theme of Adivasi tribals and indigenous people more globally. So it gives me great pleasure to give the floor to the Vice Chancellor to welcome you all here, and thank you very much for coming.
A very good morning to all of you. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you who have gathered here for this truly unique initiative. I say unique initiative because it has been, there are numerous days that one can mark in the course of a calendar, and there are so many UN designated days, and some of those days we do mark. But one of the more neglected days that most institutions, but also societies to a large extent, have been ignoring is the day that marks the world's indigenous peoples. And part of the problem is also that because that those groups of people who are whose memory, whose contributions, whose lives we are indeed recognizing today, they don't have a voice. And since that voice is largely not there, we also tend to ignore that. So I want to begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to Professor Stephen P. Marks, the Dean of the Jindal School of Public Health and Human Development, and also a good array of faculty members who have led this initiative. And of course, I appreciate the presence of several deans of the schools of JGU who are not only actively participating in this conference that is we are organizing starting today, from marginalization to empowerment, but also to be able to share their perspectives, share their reflections on this day. I would like to begin by saying that, at least in the Indian context, when we begin the discourse relating to indigenous peoples, the starting point of our own conversation is the Indian Constitution itself. As some of us are aware, the Constitution of India was indeed an extraordinary effort was made to make it as a people's document. It had opportunities for the people who were involved in the framing of the Constitution to engage with a range of peoples across India. And we were obviously not an organized society in that sense, to be able to connect with people across India. It was a time when social media and telecommunication and other forms of interaction was simply not there. But during that time, to be able to engage with a lot of people and to make them feel somehow almost being part of an effort that was essentially by the elite was itself a phenomenal effort. In fact, there is a book by Ray recently published about how the Indian Constitution's evolution as a people's constitution was reflected as a part of the historical social and evolutionary process. Granville Austin refers to that in his own first book on Indian Constitution, Cornerstone of the Nation. Both of them are very telling books with regard to the evolution of the Indian Constitution making process and how elaborate efforts were made to, to reach out to peoples across India. The second aspect of this discourse that we are having today is also about to what extent we will fashion our contemporary legal, regulatory and governance mechanisms and measures to those people who are indeed voiceless. And that's where the discourse relating to marginalization essentially moves into empowerment. Because much of that discourse, if it happens at the periphery, it also has the potential to lead to violence as well. So if we don't recognize this challenge, if we don't bring these conversations into more mainstream engagement, then we do run the risk of undermining some of the more fundamental values of our democracy. Democracy, with all its challenges, requires constant engagement with different kinds of people. While different forms of empowerment has happened in the last 75 years, there are huge communities that are left behind, and that leaving behind those communities is clearly not in the best interest of protecting the rule of law, but also to be able to build an egalitarian society. This aspect of marginalization to empowerment requires reimagination of social structures. It requires reimagination of our economic models. It requires reimagination of the federal structure on the basis of which we are governed. It also requires a reimagination of our thought process, and that's where academic institutions play a very important role. Yesterday in our convocation, we had Honorable Ms. Justice B.V. Nagaratna, who spoke on the theme building a constitutional culture, high calling for universities, and she singularly identified the role of universities in promoting a vibrant constitutional culture. And that constitutional culture is obviously expected to be encompassing and inclusive, but also democratic and participative, but also recognizing the fact that there are large number of marginalized people who do not have that voice of both representation, but also voice of acknowledgement and appreciation. I also want to mention that besides marking a day of this kind, I think it's also important for us to reach out to those communities across the country. We have been working hard to engage with certain parts of the Northeast. Professor Upasana Mahanta, the Dean of Admissions and Outreach, one of the things that she and I are working is to what extent we can bring this conversation to several parts of the Northeast part of India, but also to be able to bring those individuals, institutions, communities to be part of the conversations that happen here in our own campus, be it as students, faculty members, staff, and all of that. And I think there is no other easy way to move towards that empowerment that we are seeking when it comes to the marginalized people, especially the indigenous one. And, I also want to mention that several societies have responded to past historical discrimination, injustices in numerous ways. As we speak, there's a growing debate in the United States about affirmative action and a decision by the US Supreme Court and its implications for that society. In India, we've always had a more progressive approach towards affirmative action. We have moved in the other direction towards quotas, and that aspect has to some extent address the historically oppressed and discriminated sections of society, especially the OBCs, the SCs and STs. But the challenge remains writ large, despite significant efforts to ameliorate and even address some of those historical injustices. We still have a long way to go to build that egalitarian society. In a very famous judgment by the Supreme Court of India, Indira Sani versus Union of India, one of the judges quite remarkably mentioned that treating unequal people equally itself contributes to inequalities. So recognizing those inequalities in society and to create provisions for those individuals and peoples to be part and parcel of the society's growth and development aspirations requires significant reimagination of resources as well as policies, laws, rules and regulations. While affirmative action is one tool, including quotas, could be one tool. There could be many more ways by which we can build that egalitarian process. No society in the world has been able to address this past challenge in ways that we can be truly proud of. Many countries, including Australia and United States and others, have had to deal with past injustices. There are more, I would say, modest ways by which such recognitions have happened in different societies. But the reality, and that's one of the reasons why we are all here, we are not only marking this day, but also in many ways seeking a pledge towards our own contribution towards addressing the continuing challenges of faced by people who are historically discriminated and have not been able to get their due. The heart of this discourse ought to be our own commitment towards building a just society. Justice and its own powerful ability to seek change through empowerment is the foundational principle on the basis of which we can address issues relating to the marginalized, especially the indigenous people. I also want to mention that it is also potentially a slippery slope when we don't recognize that in this effort, violence has no room whatsoever. We need to address this through democratic engagement. We need to address this through our democratic institutions. We need to even restructure our democratic institutions through the democratic process. And that's something we need to underline, especially as a university, which is also a place where we need to recognize the role of law and instruments of legal order, because it is quite possible that in our excitement and enthusiasm to address these challenges, we might slip and end up in some context even justifying violence, which is exactly what we shouldn't be doing. There's no better way to address this than recalling our own freedom struggle. During the 1910s and 20s and 30s, there was enough temptation that was prevailing in India to seek violent response to the freedom struggle, but that was not done. It was led by none other than Mahatma Gandhi, who was deeply committed to the idea of non-violence and democratic engagement. That spirit of democratic engagement, and in later years accommodating different forms of diversity and pluralism, and building those diversities and pluralistic vision into both our constitutional order and our legal mechanisms towards addressing different forms of injustices, is another extraordinary example of how we have been able to fashion and evolve this country. In terms of our diversity, I mean, I come from a state of Tamil Nadu where till the 1970s, there were very strong movements that wanted to secede from India. In fact, there are people who even today have harbored those aspirations. But I think through the democratic spirit and the democratic engagement, we have come a long way. And today even mainstream, not just mainstream politicians, but also those politicians who had harbored that thought process in the 1950s and 60s and into early 70s, they no longer have any such aspiration, because of the fact that we've been able to build that egalitarian social, political and economic order. A few days ago, the Information Technology Minister was the Finance Minister of the state of Tamil Nadu, Dr. Palnivel Tyagarajan. He gave a beautiful talk on the idea of India. And in that idea of India, there ought to be scope and possibilities for different forms of and manifestations of peoples and their aspirations that need to be included. So I am so delighted to be in this moment at OP Jindal Global University, where we are inaugurating the conference from marginalization to empowerment, reflections on the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. I only hope that while people may not be attending the conference physically here, as we have a regular academic session now, I hope that the recorded proceedings of the conference will be available for all students, so that the conversations, the discussions, and the thematic sessions that we have in the course of today and tomorrow will be a great instruction, a great source of knowledge, perspectives that our students and faculty can gain later. So thank you very much. Once again, congratulations to all of you who are part of this effort, and this is going to be a continuing effort for all of us as to how we can all do in our own individual and institutional capacities to address the core principle of injustice and inclusivity, which is the heart of the life and journeys of the indigenous peoples in India and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Let's move quickly into the program. We are extremely privileged to have 8 deans here to express their perspective on the value of this theme from their school's agenda. And I suggest that we move quickly down the list as it appears on the program, starting with Kishle Bhattacharjee, the Dean of the School of Journalism and Communication.
Thank you so much, Steve, for inviting me and for this privilege of letting me speak first, because I have to go and take a class. I started out here today with a deep sense of regret and a confession. For more than a quarter of a century, I reported from India's regions, areas which were under the 5th schedule and the 6th schedule, apart from Jammu and Kashmir. And it was always when there was an ambush, a massacre, a disaster, or a crisis that we paratrooped out there and reported. Later I started living in those places, but it was not enough. I was still living in the cities, and I would go to the areas which were affected only when there was some kind of a situation. Now imagine for 25 years, if your television screens, if your newspapers are going to carry news of a certain communities only when there is a crisis. So all the Adivasis of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Odisha, Bengal, to people living in Delhi appear to be potential guerrillas carrying stealth rifles, because those are the images that I brought you home. Similarly, when I went to Nagaland or Manipur or Mizoram, Tripura, Assam, those are the times of very violent insurgencies, and all that I beamed to your home were of bombs and of guns. So what essentially we've done in news journalism is stereotype people. We've trapped people in images of violent guerrillas, and that's a huge violence that we have perpetrated on these communities, and for that I want to say sorry. News journalism has failed us because it has always been very Delhi centric, or whether if you go to other countries it would always be centralized only to the capital. It barely moved to the regions. Even Sonipat was never in the map. We traveled to regions only when there was, like I said, only when there was an ambush. And like now, we're all sitting out here, we all have an opinion on what's happening in Manipur. But Manipur has survived violence for the last 3 decades. And why just 3 decades? They've survived the First World War, they've survived the Second World War. For many of you, let me tell you that Britain's greatest victory in 400 years of their war history is the war they fought in Manipur. So Manipur has been at the center of a lot of violence, a lot of wars, a lot of battles that we probably were not aware of. Now, in our ad hoc and paratrooping journalism, apart from stereotyping people and places, we have also tagged them with various notions. So for example, the tribals in Northeast are alien because they don't look like us, and therefore they are potential anti-nationals, and therefore we must send the army out there to protect the geographical territory of that region. We don't send the army to other parts of the country. We do that specifically only to Jammu and Kashmir and to the Northeast. In 2012, I met a Maoist commander in his camp in Kandhamal in Orissa, and he was candid. He admitted that the movement would have died long ago if there was no state repression. He said, we enlist cadres only because the state pushes them to us. One of the key words in the two-day conference will be displacement. The indigenous people inhabit areas of vast natural reserve and conflict between the constitutional rights under the 5th and 6th schedule, and an energy-hungry nation is now going to be the heart of the matter. The Forest Conservation Act is a case in point. The forests have been declared the property of the state. This means it becomes an offense for the tribal people who have been dwelling in these forests for millennia to make a living from them. Read the Manipur situation then through the acquisition of land. Was it a mere coincidence that the new act was brought in while the dead piled up in morgues? Whether the cause is of the building of dams or mining or the nation's requirements or government decisions, the loser is usually a tribal or a Dalit. This day, marking the indigenous people, has so far not had any impact in India, barring the inevitable seminars and conferences. And I hope that we can make a beginning from JJU to try and make impact. Tribal people in this country continue to be the weakest, usually the first targets of land grab, displacement, and development. Over the next 2 days, I'm sure you will touch upon several keywords like exploitation, stereotyping, discrimination, alienation, atrocities. We at Jindal School of Journalism and Communication want to teach and practice journalism through the lens of social justice. We have a media that is driven by revenue, not by reality, by commerce, not by community, by profit, not by people. But media, journalism, academia, art, and literature did not come out of corporate investments. They came out of communities and societies. We need to return them to the people. Next week, we will be celebrating India's Independence Day. Many of India's 400-odd tribes played a tremendous part in resisting British colonialism. The single greatest thing is that there is a distinction between freedom and independence, and that the fight for both came from indigenous people. People even less privileged than us, even less privileged than the middle class. And therefore, you have a responsibility. And you cannot say, what can I do? There's nothing I can do. These people show you what ordinary people can do. And if they could do it, could we not? They are demanding that we fight to defend the ideals of the freedom struggle, that we fight to realize the principles of the freedom struggle. And that brings us very heavily into a defense of the Indian Constitution, at least justice for all, social, economic, and political. Thank you so much.
Next is the Executive Dean of the Law School, Srijit, who will address the audience. And I want to reinforce what Raj said. We hope that the recording can be widely distributed because the remarks so far have been truly profound and important to be shared.
Yep. Thank you, Professor Marks. Good morning, everybody. It's truly a great honor to become part of the inaugural session of this conference. My acquaintance with indigeneity and indigenous studies started when I was working with Arctic Keskus, or Arctic Center in Finland. That was the first job I got after completing my doctorate. I was appointed as a liaison officer between Arctic Center and the Sami community in Finland. Until then, I had absolutely no notion no clue about what does indigeneity mean. So my first effort was actually to find my own situationality. Who am I to work with the indigenous people? What voice am I? So which actually brought me into the nuances of indigenous studies as a discipline. So of course, I still believe that my perception towards indigenous studies is more culturally oriented rather than political. So my first effort was actually to try to understand what does it mean to be indigenous, or what is the understanding of indigeneity? Politically, we believe that indigenous people are those who live in the peripheries, and indigeneity lies in those peripheries, meta or material. But then I slowly understood that it may be a political periphery, but it's the cultural core. That's the center of all cultures. Living in indigenous conditions means you're living in true ontological conditions, because indigeneity is nothing but a confluence of land, animal, and nature. So if you ever want to find true ontological bliss in ontic conditions, one really need to live in the indigenous conditions, because there you find the fine confluence of land, animal, and nature. And to my surprise, I found that the clock in the Sami region ticks according to the clock of a reindeer. The respect given to an animal, and based on an animal's time that the human community there lives. So this confluence of land, animal, and nature, I understood that probably this is the organic way to lead the human life. But at the same time, I sensed that there is a global ping to civilize the indigenous community all the time. In the, adopting a discourse of empowerment, adopting a discourse of enabling, there is an effort actually to bring the indigenous community to the core. But that's literally depriving the indigenous community of its identity, or rather depriving the community of its most blissful existence in the ontological and ontic conditions. But there is a strong resistance from the indigenous communities, and I was absolutely astounded to see how the indigenous memory is kept alive. While there is a global effort to integrate indigenous youth, giving them all the promises of a cosmopolitan world, there is also a strong effort on the part of the indigenous communities to keep the indigenous memory alive through recitation of folklores, through recitation of epics which capture the true identity. And that had me reading the Finnish epic Kalevala, and I was able to transpose myself to one of those members of the Sami community whose ancestors walked through the ices and the glaciers in that region. So I understood the power of resistance, and here resistance happened mainly by keeping the memory alive. And memory was kept alive mainly by returning to the folklores. I still believe that this is the best way, rather than all kind of constitutionally, I'm sure I'm defying my discipline here, rather than all kinds of constitutionally imposed norms, that you need to keep the ontological memory alive in the people, and that's only possible by way of returning to the epics which capture the true indigenous identity. Now yes, but they know that once they are deprived of their indigenous identity by supplanting them to the global, they would be writhing in pain, because it's very difficult to live with forged identities. You all know this popular novel by Orhan Pamuk, White Castle, whereby two individuals engage in a conversation, and midway through the conversation they change their identities. The rest of the novel is about how each one writes in the identity of the other. The same with the indigenous population, if the effort is made actually to integrate them to the global. At the same time, there is an effort on the part of the global that we participate in the capital mobility, we participate in the madness of production, and then on the weekends we take refuge in indigeneity, or rather we take refuge in the peripheries, because there we get the bliss of ontology again. This very idea that indigeneity is a solace, that emphasizes that it is the true ontological condition in which human beings live. Another challenge I faced was that my voice. Who are you to speak about indigeneity? When speaking in a conference in indigenous studies in Hokkaido, a member of the Ainu community asked me, who are you to speak about indigeneity? What voice you are? An ideal response could have been that I'm a consociate in the Habermasian public space, which gives me the right to speak about anything and everything which my consciousness has created, but probably that would have been a rude academic's response. I believe that we all have indigeneity in us. We all have the ontological bliss. The ideal state of human self is zero entropy. It's a tranquil state which actually indigeneity has captured in its true essence. So I believe that there is an indigeneity in everybody. I have an inclination to return to my indigenous conditions. So I believe that gives me the right. So I didn't try to carve a political identity of me to speak on behalf of the indigenous people, but I rather try to invoke my own indigeneity within me there. And the last point, the indigenous spaces. Indigenous spaces are being destroyed. We call them periphery, and of course, many times, that there is an effort actually to integrate the periphery here. We really do not know whether this imagery of center and periphery makes sense anymore, because peripheries have moved to the center, centers have moved to the periphery. What we deemed to be the peripheries, they were probably the center. So from a very cultural perspective, I believe that we need to preserve these spaces, because today, going through a midlife crisis, my effort is to go back to those spaces, indigenous or non-indigenous, to go back to those spaces where I spent my boyhood, so that I could recover my identity lost somewhere there. Walking through those spaces, I relive my 10-year-old, 14-year-old, or my adolescent life once again. So spaces matter, and indigenous spaces are being lost in a never-before manner. But to bring all these transformations, let me be loyal to my discipline. I believe that law is going to be the most powerful means. With that sanguinity, I stop here. I'm not a subject matter expert, but I believe that my indigeneity will keep me going and sustaining in the madness which I see around me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Marks, for including me in the opening session of this. I was listening with rapt attention to Srijit. I had the privilege of attending a session of the Sami Parliament in Norway. Extraordinary, because you had representatives from many countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, at that parliament. And so it kind of shows what's possible. I mean, there's no nationalistic boundaries, and there's a sense of community among the Samis, and they have a parliament. We generally venerate our constitution, and it's a good constitution on the whole. It served us well. But in the Constituent Assembly, the indigenous peoples were very woefully underrepresented. So were others. I mean, the Muslim League left, and so the Muslim representation in the constitution was very weak. And so much of the discussion in the Constituent Assembly pertaining to the rights of indigenous peoples was somewhat given short shrift. There was a committee on minorities and tribal areas, but by and large they took over the Government of India Act of 1935, which had created these scheduled areas and had created enormous powers to the governors. Today, the Constituent Assembly on the whole wanted the powers of the governors to be limited. They wanted them to be non-political actors, they wanted them to be impartial, but they didn't draft the instrument of instructions that an independent India needed. And the instrument of instructions given to the governors of the scheduled regions gave them enormous powers over the natural resources and over the people. But fortunately, there was one man who spoke for indigenous peoples in the Constituent Assembly, Jaipal Singh Munda, an extraordinary person who grew up herding cattle, enjoying the spaces that Srijit referred to in his childhood, and then ended up studying at Oxford, thanks to helpful missionaries. He became a blue in Oxford for hockey. He joined the Indian Civil Service. He came first in the interview in 1928, but was asked to captain the Indian team at the Olympics in Amsterdam, but the ICS authorities would not give him leave of absence. So he just resigned from the ICS and went to captain India, and India won the first gold medal in the hockey in that Olympics. And then he came and set up the Adivasi Mahasabha, and fortunately got elected to the Constituent Assembly, where he had, the debates show very interesting dialogues between him and an old Gandhian, was then about 80 years old, called A.V. Thakkar. But then there is this Gandhian who was somewhat condescending and patronizing. He was in fact supportive of the indigenous peoples and the tribals, but the standpoint from which he was doing it was one of, superiority. I mean, we will help you. There were many interesting dialogues. Somebody said to Jaipal Singh, you're wearing all these fancy suits. You stay at the Imperial Hotel in Delhi. How can you speak for indigenous peoples? Is a question. And he had to say, can you speak any indigenous people's language for a start, right? So I have to quote him at the start of our thing as a tribute to Jaipal Singh. He said at the start of on 16th of December 1946, in the Constituent Assembly, he said, I rise to speak on behalf of millions of unknown hordes, yet very important, of unrecognized warriors of freedom, the original people of India, who have variously been known as backward tribes, primitive tribes, criminal tribes, and everything else. Sir, I am proud to be a Jungli. That is the name by which we are known in my part of the country. As a Jungli, as an Adivasi, I am not expected to understand the legal intricacies of the resolution. He means the objectives resolution. You cannot teach democracy to the tribal people. You have to learn democratic ways from them. They are the most democratic people on earth. So he, and then there were many issues on which he spoke up. One of them was on prohibition. The Gandhians, of course, wanted, it's in the directive principles, prohibition, and he spoke up and he said, you're completely misunderstanding this. You don't understand culture. I mean, the rice beer is essential to the cultural life of tribal peoples. They wouldn't do anything without it, and so even in Bhutan, though as Buddhists they offer alcohol to at the start of this kind of a seminar in Bhutan. We all had a quick sniff of alcohol. So he spoke up against that. So you see, the thing is, he punched holes in all these pretensions that people have, that somehow they are superior to tribal peoples. And the sad thing is, it took about, he coined the word Jharkhand, Jhar meaning forest, and Khand, of course, like Bharatkhand is region, area. He coined it and wanted, more autonomy, independence. The emphasis in our constitution is on the individual and on individual rights. But the point about indigenous peoples is they don't emphasize the individual. It is always the community. They never had individual property ownership. It is the entire people, the community that owned the property, which is why they were subjected to all kinds of exploitation. They say, your lands are submerged by the Narmada Sagar, but as individuals, what did you own that we can compensate? But as individuals, they own nothing, right? They were whole people. So we've got, it's a sorry story of how the 5th and the 6th schedules have been used against the interests of indigenous peoples. That it took, the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act gave some kind of recognition to community institutions in these areas, but not adequate. The Forest Rights Act of 1976 was made a start, but now we are rolling back. The only concern now seems to be the exploitation of natural resources in the regions that are where indigenous peoples of India live. And it's getting worse by the day. The very recent amendment to the Forest Act is an example of that, as to rendering indigenous peoples voiceless. So I think as a educational institution, we must celebrate the leaders of the indigenous peoples of India, but also all across the world. And the declaration on the rights of indigenous people still remains a declaration, and we need to do our bit to work towards making it into a convention that has legal binding in international law. So that's a hope and aspiration to which an university can contribute, professors can contribute to that, students can contribute to that. So that's my hope. Thank you.
Let me ask Dean Kathleen Bedrowski to speak for the School of Liberal Arts and Humanities.
Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm going to speak from my own experience in the United States, mainly because I haven't had the opportunity to work with Indigenous communities here in India. But I'd like to cite two instances that have greatly impressed me. The first one, which didn't come along in time as the first, was my introduction to Letty Scott Nupananga, who is from a tribal group, an Aboriginal group in Australia. And Letty came from Australia to the United States to meet with Oren Lyons, who worked with a Native American who worked with the UN. Letty's husband was killed in incarceration in Australia. And the newspapers wrote this off as another druggie alcoholic who hung himself in prison. This was all too common, and Letty would not let this go. So rather than rely upon the good people in Australia, Letty brought together the tribal groups in the United States to support her travels, her legal issues, and also sponsored her art programs in the United States. Unfortunately, Letty passed away about 7 years ago. But her reasons for being in the United States, for working with the various groups of Native peoples in the United States has remained in memory, and also brought to life the tremendous injustice that certain people in the United States and Australia and throughout the world are throwaway people. What they have to say doesn't mean anything. And many people realized that the only way to gain some kind of power is to join together, to band together, and to create the reimagination of their own reality. So this is something that I'm seeing in my own hometown of Southampton, New York. There is a very large and growing group of Shinnecock Indians who live on the reservation. Luckily, they've been able to hang on to their land, even though this is extremely valuable development property. Everyone wants to get their hands on bayside, seaside property because the value is tremendous, and they have very courageously hung on to it rather than squander their money on immediate needs. One of the ways in which I feel that we can work with them, and I'm going to give you the example of the Shinnecock, is through educational institutions. And by that I mean work as facilitators for different groups who come to you. Not saying, can you come and present as we want you to present what you want to present. One of the things that I did working every year was have a course with the Shinnecock in which I said they had to be named as the main professors in the course because they had the knowledge and ours was only an interpretation. This became a very powerful tool in the university to see ourselves as facilitators and eventually include people as part of the faculty, and they would have a voice in the faculty and use of the land. I found something very telling when you would try to introduce someone from the Shinnecock tribe as a guest speaker. And the speaker would often say, welcome to my land, you are my guests. Which is really very true and very powerful to understand that we in the United States, and I'm sure this happens also in India, are on someone else's land. Over the period that I've been working 20 years and have friends and have been associated with the Shinnecock, I've seen tremendous changes occur. Many of the young people have gone to university, but that's not the only key. The university, as I said, is a facilitator, but it shouldn't be a definer of the way that people look at themselves, the tools that they look at. Some of the main accomplishments that I witnessed this summer working with people on the reservation was they've started a very vibrant kelp farm. And this is to the benefit of the entire community. It cleans up the dirty water. It's a food source. They're using traditional efforts. And also it started out with a group of 6 women who felt terribly committed to introducing the old ways. The other is introduction of traditional crops and growing traditional crops in the traditional way, which now is recognized as something that's very smart for restoration of the soil. They also have the people on the reservation have taken the initiative to become leaders in the community themselves. They've created an art fellowship program that is functioning worldwide, in which young artists are welcomed for months to 2-month-long periods on the reservation. In addition to that, they're publishing their own literature, and they also have increased the power of their tribal government. So these are all very important steps that are taken. The Shinnecock are highly criticized. They're criticized in the community because they make a lot of base money, since they can escape federal laws on limitations of selling alcohol, which they do. And when criticized, they say, look what you've done to us. We have the right to also earn funding the way we can. And yet at the same time, putting this to good. So it's kind of a mixed call, and I say, who are we to judge? But there is a certain power of accumulating money, and as I said, I feel that rather than telling people how they should live, what they should aspire to, but putting them in positions to define themselves, being able to enlarge our communities so that people from Indigenous groups can become faculty people and define what they want to teach as well, the way they want to. So education is something that we can do, we can use as a tool within our own communities, within our own way of working. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. In the interest of time, I'm putting on my hat now as Dean of the School of Public Health and Human Development, but I'm going to save time by sitting here and saying the 2 sentences that I want to say from our perspective, so we can move on to the next deans who are going to talk. The first point is, of course, that when you consider Indigenous peoples from the perspective of public health, the flagrant fact before everybody is that no health disparities are greater than those affecting this population. The challenge is therefore absolutely fundamental in all societies where there are populations that identify as Indigenous peoples or as tribals or as Adivasi, to address the disparities in public health. And the second is that our school is called the School of Public Health and Human Development for a very good reason. Human development and capabilities, as articulated by Amartya Sen and others, and by the Human Development and Capabilities Association, addresses an approach to development that is inclusive, that is based on justice, and the challenges for addressing rights of Indigenous peoples, including through the thematic group of the Human Development Capabilities Association, of which I'm a member, is seeking to address the human rights and human development and capabilities approach to empowerment. And I'm very grateful to the Vice Chancellor for capturing the title of this conference, From Marginalization to Empowerment. That's really what it's all about, and it's very true from the perspective of public health. And now I'd like to give the floor to Dennis Layton to speak from the perspective of the Jindal School of Languages and Literature. Dennis.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this very important occasion, conference of OP Jindal Global University. I just have very few things to say. I want, first of all, point out that the keynote address this morning will be about Indigenous people's rights and responses to climate crisis. Now, I'm supposed to be speaking on behalf of the Jindal School of Languages and Literature, which I am, and I'm simply going to make a very simple point here. As has been advocated or communicated by groups like Cultural Survival and many others over the past decades, cultural survival in terms of preservation of cultural and social practices, as well as actual livelihoods of Indigenous people, of course, has been a great challenge in the world today. And attention in recent years to what we call the Sustainable Development Goals has kind of given a certain, I think, useful fillip or lift to various theories about correlations or relationship between linguistic diversity and, above all, biodiversity, right? This is something that scholars and, of course, Indigenous scholars among Indigenous peoples have been pointing out for a long time, that there's a very clear correlation between linguistic diversity and biodiversity. And I'm not at all interested in instrumentalizing this and saying that, oh, it's the wisdom of Indigenous peoples communicated through their languages, which is going to save the planet. I think sometimes rather expansive and exaggerated claims are made about that, but it's certainly worth thinking about. Whether one operates from the perspective of, anthropology or philosophy or Indigenous studies themselves, it's something that we really need to take very seriously. The perception, at least, that monolingualism leads to monologism. In other words, there's a very real possibility that uniformity in use of language around the world, as well as within particular countries such as India, does present a very serious threat to a kind of intellectual heritage of not only those communities, but of the whole world. Now, I'd like to be able to say that my school is committed to offering regular instruction in various Indigenous languages that are used in India. I'm not prepared to roll out that kind of program. It's something that I'm thinking about all the time, that I and my colleagues are thinking about. But certainly the general point that monolingualism is dangerous in many ways does have a positive side, in the sense that by giving due attention and due respect to use of multiple languages by most of us, in fact, on a daily basis. It's a matter of degree, which languages we use and in which contexts. Certainly, Indigenous activists have a lot to tell us, to teach us about the kind of wisdom and the kind of knowledge, the episteme, one might say, that is captured through their languages, and there certainly is a lot there for the world at large to learn from, and I think it really is a matter of a planetary future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and my appreciation to Professor Stephen for inviting me. So I am the Dean of Psychology. When we look around the world today, psychology as an academic discipline is quite diverse. We have practitioners in every country of the world today. But when you look back on the history of this field, it was really quite homogenous all the way up through the 1970s. It was really dominated by white men from North America and Western Europe. So beginning in the 70s and moving forward into the 80s and 90s, there was a real pushback against that. And we had the rise of these subdisciplines, two of which is cultural psychology and indigenous psychology. And in both cases, it was really pushing for recognition that when we do look around the world at these various societies, of course there's going to be differences. These differences include cultural norms, socioeconomics, language, of course, and even the basics of simply geography and the ecology of where different people reside. And so as we've gone forward, there's been a real appreciation and a real attention put forth to try to understand whether these psychological theories, findings, and constructs that we have related to development, related to personality, related to our social relationships, etc. But it's more than that. Another side of psychology is not just trying to understand human beings and human behavior, but it's also to aid and treat. So do our concepts related to diagnostics of how we understand mental illness, right? Do all of this, does it align with those Western ideals, or do we see differences? And certainly what we know from research over the last few decades is there are very clearly quite large differences. So, in my own school, I have a large number of psychologists, and certainly there are many here in India, that really try to look at these various psychological phenomenon from what we might say is an Indian context. And just as one example, when we look in India, we find that the role of the family, both the immediate family and the extended family, plays a much greater role in the development of an individual than we may see in the West, for example. But when we look at the size of India, the number of people, the diversity, the languages, etc., even that probably will not be sufficient, right? You look at the economic disparities, you look at the social stratification. So the point of fact is that indigenous psychology is trying to go one step further, is trying to look at these local groups of people, be they tribal people or otherwise, and trying to understand, again, these psychological phenomena from their perspective. And of course, this isn't limited to India. We have the Native Americans, we have South Africa, apartheid. So again, this has been sort of undergone and developed within many different nations around the world. And I do think that as a psychologist, our overarching goal is to really understand human beings, right? The common definition that we have, and I hear from a lot of my students, is psychology studies behavior and mind, or mental processes, which is true. And certainly we know that there is a lot of overlap. There's a lot of commonality for all human beings on this planet. But by focusing on those commonalities, that doesn't mean that we should overlook those differences that make individual groups distinct and unique one from another. And so if we do want to assist, right, look at Manipur. It's not just the geography, it's not just the language, it's the conflict. Right? So if we really want to understand human beings, and more importantly, if we want to assist those individuals in need, there is a real need for us to go further and try to understand the individuals and their representation within these groups, particularly these smaller indigenous groups. So with that, I will leave it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Derek. And our final dean to speak is Jaideep Chatterjee, the dean of the School of Art and Architecture.
I'm just going to speak from here, if it's all right by you, Steve. Thank you so much. Good morning to everyone, and thank you so much, Steve, for asking me to speak. It's always difficult to speak last, especially when you're followed by so many illustrious people who have made excellent points, but I'm going to try and speak a bit from the perspective of my discipline and my school, which is the School of Art and Architecture. I want to start by saying that if there is any discipline which is perhaps more guilty than the journalism, which has been literally destructive of indigenous worlds and lives, it's been architecture, right? If there's any, if there is an apology there, let me go out and say that greater than anybody. You know, in my own work, this is something I've argued. And what I've said is, it's very interesting, is that the very term architecture and architect are extremely problematic. They're problematic because they're constantly evoking a particular kind of history. The term archi in architecture actually means first. It means originary, right? And it works. I mean, every time we use this term to talk about the way we build things, right, we are constantly evoking a particular history, right? And this history is very interesting because what it does is it denigrates difference. It takes that difference and it turns it into a hegemonic structure of value, right? And what it does is that this structure of value is incredibly violent. It is structurally violent towards others, right? Whether this be different people, different things, different objects, and environments. And the interesting thing is, in the first place, all this othering is done precisely by the invocation of that history itself, which is again sort of invoked by this term architecture. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Let us say we are standing here in front of the Agra fort. We constantly think of that fort as belonging to some other time, to some other place. What we fundamentally do is what the anthropologist Johannes Fabian has called the denial of coevalness. The fact that actually, for all practical purposes, that fort exists with us, is already with us, is always with us. But yet what architecture and this way of historicizing, what is called a historicist paradigm, actually takes something that exists with us and turns it into something else that is both away from us, far, far away from us, and something which has no effect on us. It's by this constant mode of othering is that we create other people, other places, indigenous, and we have this term, very interesting term in architecture called vernacular architecture, right? And so we take that term and then we make it into another term which then allows what we call proper or modern architecture to transpire, and for architects to aspire to that, right? Constantly. This is something that cannot go on. Indeed, I want to end with something that we have been trying at our school. One of the first things that we have our students read is this little letter by apparently Chief Seattle, who had written it to the President of the United States. Now, the authenticity of this letter is a little doubtful, but I have them read it because it I think hits some of the things that we want to do at this school. This is what the letter says, and I read snippets of it. The Chief says, "The President in Washington sends his word that he wishes to buy our land. But how can we buy or sell the sky, the land? The idea is strange to us. If we do not own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of water, how can you buy them?" Right? Will you teach your children what we have taught our children, that the earth is our mother? What befalls the earth befalls all of us. This we know. The earth does not belong to man. Man belongs to earth. All things are connected like blood that unites us. Man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. When we finish this letter, we tell our students one thing, that how can you, as designers, as builders, in fact, and then we turn around and say, we are not going to use this term architecture and architects in our school. That how can you actually go ahead and build and make things without claims to binaries such as them, us, right? Thank you.
Let me take the floor from here briefly to thank once again these deans. Frankly, from my point of view, I found their presentations nothing short of spectacular. I really thought that we were enlightened by these diverse perspectives, 8 different perspectives that show the relevance, and not only the relevance intellectually, but the relevance in terms of what we can do as we understand our role in society, our role in this university. But in order to give us a broader perspective to the global approaches to addressing Indigenous peoples' rights, it gives me particular pleasure now to invite Stella Tamung to take the podium and to address us. She is a good friend who sits on the board of Cultural Survival, an Indigenous-run organization that has a few non-Indigenous people on its board, like myself, and I'm extremely proud to have anything to do with that organization and to be able to work with somebody of the outstanding character of Stella, who's going to talk to us now. So if you want to come and take the floor, Stella.
I thought I would have done that. Thank you so much, Steve. I don't know whether I really deserve that much of, words that you have said about me, and thank you so much for that. What a day to be with you all. What an event, what a celebrations. I feel really honored to be here, to be with you all and celebrate International World Indigenous Peoples Day. So I don't know whether I should greet you all by saying Happy Indigenous Day. I don't know what should be the best way to greet you all, but I would like to begin with that. I don't know whether there is anything left for me to say because, the Vice Chancellor, his dream of building a very equal and just society, he also mentioned about, democratizing the constitutions where, everyone can fit in and create a space. And the deans, everyone, I was just thinking that, I should be in a very quiet room and just reflect and sit with whatever you have said. There is nothing that I should disagree, but really agree to it. And this is the day, like Indigenous people, because I belong to it, and we have been dreaming. The dream we had is the struggle of Indigenous people should not be the struggle of Indigenous people only. It should be the struggle of each and everyone. And I feel very hesitant to, separate myself as Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and I don't understand this. And someone spoke about indigeneity, and definitely it is indivisible. No one can claim to own it, because everyone has that. So how can Indigenous people should say that, this is ours and, this is ours and no one should get into it? And I think, the environment and the vision and the dream that all of you have spoken exactly is the dream I really had also wished for. And it is not only my individual wish and dream, I think it is the dream of all the Indigenous people. And I'm really happy that, I'm hearing this and I'm witnessing it. And I don't know how to thank Steve. What a privilege and what an honor to be here, and to be listening and to be witnessing this. And thank you so much once again. I would like to start by saying namaste and then pyapula. Pyapula is a greeting in my language. Pyapula means I offer you my hands. It's a kind of service. But this greeting also is very much a city-centered, and I don't know, people would call it elitist. If you go to the villages, the greeting, the kind of greeting that you would be greeted would be, the first thing would be, have you eaten? Eating is very important. Have you eaten? How are you? And where are you going? These are the greetings, whenever we meet each other. Eating is very important. And I was so impressed that, today's event started with even where is, the wonderful, young students who took us, and, they said, it begins with eating. So Indigenous people, we love eating, and eating is very important. I am Stella Tamang. Tamang is not a family name, and it is not a caste. Whenever I have to fill up the form, I don't know what to do with that, because Tamang is the name of my tribe. Because we were made to feel so low, you know, Tamang being equated with the potters, you know, like someone, you know, who will carry, and then someone who is stupid, someone who would be just doing some cleaning works, and so it was a kind of so derogative. And from our generation, especially with my husband and with me, and there are 3-4 people who could make it up to the university, we thought we should write the names that we have been made to be very ashamed of. So Stella is a given name. I don't know what it meant. My parents also didn't know what it means. Some people would think that, oh, she's a Christian. I'm not Christian. But it was a given name. I liked it. There was a time that I was quite hesitant about it, but now I like it. So Stella, I'm Stella Tamang. And I don't know, I have a very strange date of birth. My mother would say I was born when the harvesting was done. She said, you know, oh, you were born, you know, and that was the time we had just finished our harvest. And then she will also try to think more in detail, and she would say, oh, it was with the second crow of the cock in the morning. I wish I can write this date of birth, you know, as my date of birth rather than, you know, September 1st or, you know, like this. So it's really strange. And I'm really impressed with this conference, and especially with the title, and that is From Marginalizations to Empowerment. This word empowerment, to be very honest, traumatized me. Traumatized me. I must be very honest to say this. What does empowerment means? From this Stella to become the other Stella? I don't know, what does this empowerment means? Because the kind of pain that I have gone through in order to fit into the structures that is given to me, the kind of pain that I have gone through to become like someone than what I am actually should have been, the pain of speaking someone language and not my language, it is no, you should not be surprised if I have a written note, because this is not my language. And I want to finish it within 15 minutes, and I should write, otherwise, you know, I will be beating around the bush, you know, talking all nonsense. So it's very painful. You know, so we really need to understand what is empowerment means. Like empowerment means, you know, we are not changing the dog into the horse. You know, for me, empowerment is to see that this dog is really a very good dog and not rather becoming a horse. So I just want to draw the attention, and I really, because the whole process of the conference is on reflecting and, you know, responding to it. And so I think, you know, it's really important that, you know, we really reflect on the word empowerment and what do we really mean by that. So that is one thing I really want to bring it. And Venu, she is not here today, and I heard that she would be joining tomorrow. And she said, you know, Stella, you would be talking, would you be needing PowerPoint, and would you have something documented? And I said, see, I'm a grandmother, and I have a little bit of reputation of telling stories. So I said, you know, don't worry, I will be telling stories, and, you know. So today I will be telling stories about myself and about my ethnicity, and that is the Mountain Indigenous people. And of course, I'm here representing cultural survival, so I will be telling the story of cultural survival in a very short way. Okay. We are mountain people. Mountain is not only of rocks and rivers, trees and plants, you know, animals and species. It is more than that. Our mountain is a sacred and a holy place where Dev and Devtas and Devis, isn't it, deities, spirits, evil spirit and spirit, all kind, because in a certain space of the forest, like somehow we feel a very strange feelings. Maybe, there is some kind of spirit. So, mountain means so many things. We love mountain. Tamil people are mountain people. If you have been to Kathmandu, the villages around Kathmandu Valley, and those are the villages of Tamil people. We love it. We worshipped. Our worshipping areas are all on the mountains. Of course, the trees, some rocks, some rivers in that. And the kind of value that we have is even our cremation sites are always on the mountain. We are not taken to the river, but we are taken to the top of the mountain because we liked it, and we thought, our life should start with the mountain and ends in the mountain itself. So our people, someone was asking, about what kind of people, Tamil people are. We love singing and dancing, and we have our own very beautiful rhythms. And we dance and we sing. Sometimes we are very, some people get confused also looking at that, because even our death rituals, even our funerals, it has songs and a kind of group steps, which people will think that, how, when people die, you can sing and dance. But those are all about, how life is, how life begins, and how it ends. It's all a kind of, someone was talking about the oral traditions and recitations and song. So those are the knowledge and wisdoms about human life. And if you go to the Tamil villages during the season, like you will see it just have gone, you will see the farmers, Tamil farmers, plowing the field, and you will hear them singing. The song is, if I wish you can understand the language, the song is, they will be singing, requesting the bullock, the bulls, asking for permissions. I'm not doing it like this. Just excuse me. You do your work and I'm also doing my work. And at the end of the plowing, I will promise that you will have very green grass to eat. And the song also includes that when you step in the mud, be very gentle, because there are some insects and you might step on it and you might kill it. So, like the communication the farmer has with the bullock, it is really so precious and it has so much of wisdom. And the communication is not only with the bullock, even with the plow, the wooden plow. The farmer will be singing and asking for permissions with the Mother Earth and requesting the plow, the wooden plow, not to be hard, because you might kill the insects which is in the mud. So look at the kind of communications and the relationship would have. This is where I feel like wow, I belong to such a wonderful community. But I always have a question, because I don't know why our ancestors love the mountains, which is really very difficult to climb up and down, and but these days life is becoming much, much, much easier. So again, the question of the language. The language is so important for us, and our language is means of communication not only with a human being. Like I said, we can communicate with living and non-living, visible and invisible beings. So it's not only talking with the human beings. So these are the power of the language that we have. Imagine losing these languages. It is not only like, say it being not very responsible of, we are losing it, but I think it's a crime, when you witness that, such an important language is just disappearing, because so many other powerful languages are just, imposed on us and at the cost of our own language. And of course, like I said, the land is very important. This is why we say the land and the language is our life. Without the land and the language, we cannot survive. Someone was talking about the dam, dam constructions and then reallocating the people somewhere else. It is not only the place, it is not only the shelter, but they are totally disconnected with the place, that which is very powerful and from where they have been created. So the whole cosmovision, values, tradition, practices, I think this is what we are really very happy for and we are very proud of also. But I would also like to correct one thing. I don't want to give the impression, and I don't want to claim that, Indigenous people world is perfect. We are also not perfect. We should not be saying that, all the wisdom is with us. And I will not even try to claim that. Nothing is perfect. As the indigenous world is not perfect, so is the non-indigenous modern world also is not perfect. I think we should be complementing each other. Isn't it? There is a lot of reasons to learn from indigenous people, and there is a lot of reason to learn from the other side also. I think this is how I think the future world that we should really like to see for. But I will not deny that the life the indigenous people are living these days is miserable. Maybe 2 or 3 people might have done it. Otherwise, if we look at the majority, still, we have been denied of our right. We are not talking about development, we are talking about survival. Because our languages is disappearing, our culture is disappearing. Isn't it? The whole wisdom which comes with the language is just disappearing. So this is where I think this celebration of August 9th really call for, how each and everyone can take responsibility and can join hands to protect the right of indigenous people so that indigenous people also can live in this world with the full dignity. I think human dignity is so important. How can we live at the cost of others' life? We talk about animals, we talk about plants and different things. So how can we live at the cost of others' life? How can we say progress and development at the cost of other human being? I think unless everyone is not together, I think we cannot say that. And I think at least the 21st century human civilization, I think this is the time that we should correct. And I feel really proud, listening to all the dean. I think all the students, if there are many students, I think you are very lucky to have such a dean, so enlightened, such a wonderful vision they have. And I was telling her that I feel a bit jealous also, because the kind of opportunity that you have, I think you are very lucky, and you should be very proud for that also. Now about the cultural survival, and someone talk about, I think you said it, and I think you are the third person that I am hearing that UN Declaration on the Right of the Indigenous People is very weak instruments. It's a very weak tool. It is just a declaration. Declaration is not legally binding. Unless, it is made a convention. Because we had Nepal, everyone is very much acquainted with the political situations of Nepal. We have the new constitutions. During the time, indigenous people, definitely, the only instruments that we had, the legal instrument that we had, at least, a kind of UN standard that we had was the Declaration on the Right of the Indigenous People. That was highly quoted, but we felt how weak it is because we had this ILO, ILO conventions, at least that really try to support us. So I think it's high time that, we raise up the voice about getting it as a conventions. And last year, I think in 2023, sessions of UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous People, I thought now I have a very good reason to attend again, because in the meantime, I stopped going there. And the only reason that I thought I should attend is, to really initiate and to push that, this draft declaration is now declared as a convention and not as a draft declaration. Not only as a declaration. So it was around the year 2000. I was very active at the UN, advocating to have UN Permanent Forum be formed. And that was the time that, I met someone from Culture Survival. I had quite a good energy. I tried to shake UN bodies regarding the indigenous people issue. So I was requested, if I could be on the board. And I have been on the board from the last 2005. So it has been really a long one. And this time, I thought, I should resign and, I should discontinue. But there was a request that Stella, no, we still need you. So, I have accepted that and I'm still on the board. I'm really happy that, I'm on the board of Culture Survival. Because again, this Culture Survival was created by a couple. Both of them were anthropologists, Pierre and David. I think Steve will have also more to say about it. These couple who are anthropologists working in Latin America. I think they thought, they should create an organization, and they had created it, and it was joined by many anthropologists and professors like Steve did. And they are all non-indigenous people, and what a symbolic meaning it has, a body, they had created it. And of course, again, they worked in Amazon, and then in Africa, and later, extended to Asia, and Culture Survival. Of course, now the board is, like Steve said, now it is more owned by indigenous people. I have a little hesitance about it, Steve, because I really want to work together. I don't want to say that, Culture Survival should be just controlled by indigenous people only. I don't agree with that. I really want to work, together. I think that should be the spirit. We work in various fields, from indigenous people livelihood, indigenous people culture, tradition, focusing a lot on indigenous women, because when we talk about indigenous wisdom and knowledge, especially connected with the biodiversity, I think indigenous people really hold a lot of knowledge about that. So we work on various fields, but especially focus on language. Disappearing languages, empowering and supporting indigenous people to work on that and to raise and to advocate the right of indigenous peoples, the indigenous people's right related to language. And in the last more than 10 or 15 years, we are focusing more on community radio, because we thought information is so important, information is so powerful. But a very powerful, very strong, very important information, if it is given in only one main language, I think many indigenous people are going to be deprived of that, because indigenous people have their own different languages. So we thought, creating community radio would be the best, which would be owned, controlled, and run by indigenous people. So now we have a community radio, a very powerful, very successful community radio in Latin America and in Africa also. And we are slowly moving to Asia. And this is why Steve and myself, we are very much after that, cultural survival get into India also, because I really thought that, it should be in Nepal. So we have cultural survival in Nepal and in Myanmar also. But, we really wish that it should come to definitely to India also. So this community radio, I think if you look at Cultural Survival website, you will have more information. Now we are working more than 20 countries from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And it's a very powerful tool. And not only running the community radio, but also, trying to advocate and influence all the legal law and act and policy and program related with the media. So this is what I really want to share about cultural survival. So having said this, I really would like to say thank you to the O.P. Jindal Global University, especially the Public Health and Human Development faculty for organizing such a meaningful conference. And I wish there were more audience. I wish, whatever we have spoken today in this closed door be rich outside wall also, because everyone who have spoken is so meaningful and is so powerful. I think that is really what I would say, a very empowering one. And having said this, again, thank you for giving me opportunity and giving me this space. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Well, as we all know, we are behind the time, but I think we can proceed. Shall we do the film first, or should we do the felicitation first? Okay. So we have traditions here, and I think it would be a great pleasure for me to, as we use the verb in India, to felicitate our guest speaker. And let me do this in front of the cameras and express. How can we do this without me? Let's start with the scarf. The traditional scarf of O.P. Jindal Global University that has your name on it.
Wow.
And is deliberately designed to be warm so that you can wear it in the mountains that you were telling us about.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
And we also have a gift for you here. And let's add one more item, which is this pen that writes extremely well.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much.
So while we're focusing on Stella and her contribution, let me bring out a point that she was making about the potential, and especially with Dennis here, since it has to do primarily with languages and community radio. We would like to make this an opportunity for us to think collectively, how could the strength of 50 years' experience of cultural survival be made available to those who are interested in promoting the rights of Adivasi and tribal communities in India, utilizing the experience that has been gained in Latin America and Africa, not only in the languages field, but in other domains. I'm looking at Ajay Pandey. The term empowerment that you referred to as being important in the title of this conference, from marginalization to empowerment. Of course, you co-direct a center on the legal empowerment of the poor, and that's another domain where there could be convergence of mission and responsibility to try to respond to needs in ways that draw upon the skills that you bring to the legal empowerment of the poor. So community radio, legal empowerment of the poor, and many other areas are ways in which we could translate the good intentions and the brilliant ideas of this conference into something meaningful that makes a difference. Now, we also have to organize the rest of the morning in order for us to go to lunch at 12. We're obviously not going to succeed in that regard. But can we show the film now? I'm looking at my team here. So Stella was alluding to the Permanent Forum and the other mechanisms of the United Nations that seek to advance the cause of indigenous peoples. For those of you who are not aware of it, the references made by several speakers, including Sudarshan and Stella, to UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that, as was stressed by two people, needs to be reinforced by being made legally binding, but for the moment articulates in very meaningful ways how we understand the rights of indigenous peoples, is also part of a range of activities in the United Nations system. One of the most valuable tools that are used by the United Nations are what is called special procedures. Committees and individuals that are given specific tasks to speak essentially truth to power. And we have the privilege of having the special rapporteur who holds one of these mandates, special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, who would have been with us if he could have, but the distance is quite long for him. So he recorded for us a video of a message for today. And I think if we can then move down there and watch it. Okay. So we're going to move down and watch this video. And then I'm going to have our colleagues, Sneha Krishnan and Diksha Tiwari, provide us with a more thorough overview of the program, both the thematic panels and the cultural activities. But for now, let's watch the presentation by the Special Rapporteur of the UN.
I wish to thank to the authorities of Kinder Global University, especially to the Dean of the School of Public Health and Human Development, Professor Dr. Stephen Marks. My greetings to all the students and the audience in this important event, and I will try to say something about the role of potential impact on indigenous people's rights of international response to the climate crisis. It is known through that peoples and communities that have contributed the least to the current climate crisis suffer the greatest consequences. Indigenous people's ways of life and scientific and technical knowledge have contributed for centuries to maintaining the environmental balance of the world's most biodiverse areas, which is why they can also actively contribute to climate change adaptation and mitigation. Despite their dual status as victims and agents of transformation, these people have not been included as stakeholders and subjects of collective rights in the definition of environmental protection policies. As a result, several of the policies on the subject have implied the displacement of their communities and the appropriation of the resources by third parties. Although international conferences on climate change have begun to recognize the right of indigenous people and their importance in addressing climate change, the measures that have been taken so far are insufficient. Indigenous people as victims of climate change. Indigenous people generally inhabit some of the territories most vulnerable to weather phenomena brought about climate change, such as island, high altitude tropical rainforest, coastal regions, desert and polar areas, where floods, droughts, forest fires, extreme winters, and summers, among others, are affecting many people in different ways. The direct dependence of indigenous peoples on their lands, territories, and resources make the consequences greater in their communities. In addition, change in climate change increase the risk of disease, modify animal migration routes, reduce biodiversity, and destroy crops. Some examples of the vulnerability of indigenous peoples' territories are the melting of the Arctic ice, where the territories of the Inuit people are located. The disappearances of the Pacific island inhabited by indigenous people, and the scarcity of water in the highlands of Bolivia. Climate change particularly affects indigenous women because its consequences are added to the existing condition of poverty and discrimination, reducing their access to natural resources and thus making their living condition on their territory more difficult. The effect of climate change have forced many indigenous men to migrate to the cities, which increase the workload of their wives and partners in agricultural work and caring for their families. Likewise, when indigenous women migrate to cities, many of them are forced to work in informal sectors of the economy, increasing the risk of labor and sexual exploitation and poverty. In addition, they lose the leadership role they had in the communities as bearers of scientific and technical knowledge of the peoples, as they do not have necessary environment for their practices and development. Indigenous people, agent of transformation. The traditional territories of indigenous peoples occupy 22% of the planet's surface and are home to 80% of the world biodiversity. Likewise, indigenous people represent 90% of the planet's cultural diversity, even though they make up only 6% of the world population. For this reason, it is affirmed that their ways of life, land tenure system, sustainable resources management, and scientific and technological knowledge are directly related to the biological diversity of the territories they inhabit. Despite this, indigenous people continue to be dispossessed of their land, territories, and resources for conservation areas, climate change programs, national parks, game reserves, and protection of cultural heritage. Historically, the knowledge of indigenous people has enabled them to cope with different climatic challenges and to ensure their food security. For example, in Alaska, Inuit people have used knowledge of climate variation to develop hunting. In the Andes, the Inca people developed scientific knowledge about crop diversification, genetic diversity, bed cultivation, agroforestry, climate forecasting, and water harvesting that is still used in agriculture today. In Kenya, the knowledge of agropastoralist people about fauna, flora, and the known winds, among others, allow them to predict drought. Thanks to this type of scientific and technical knowledge, indigenous people are able to provide solutions to mitigate the effect of climate change. For this reason, organizations such as the International Forum of Indigenous People on Climate Change have stated that these people are able to document their knowledge, monitor the climate, develop responses and early warning systems to face disasters, apply their traditional agricultural techniques, protect and restore forests, manage coastal marine areas, preserve their ways of life, etc. In particular, the forum stated in tropical forests, countries with a high terrestrial emission mitigation potential, indigenous people can play a key role in halting deforestation rapidly if their territories are protected through land titling, enabling community forestry, and strengthening local governance. In my 2022 report to the Human Rights Council entitled Indigenous Women and Development, the Application, Preservation, and Transmission of Scientific and Technical Knowledge, I argue that indigenous women have played a key role in the preservation and development of knowledge that has enabled the ecosystem diversity of indigenous territories. Therefore, the deep understanding indigenous women have of botany and animal species can contribute to climate science and mitigate the catastrophic effect of climate change. Indigenous women have leadership role in climate change adaptation and mitigation that needs to be empowered. For example, in Australia, women in Kimberley region created the Matawarra River Council and adopted the Fitzroy River Declaration, which commits them to protect the interests of the river in order to preserve the life and health of present and future generations. In East Timor, indigenous women have extended the mangrove forest in order to preserve the coastline and prevent water salinization. In Mexico, indigenous women have led groundwater recovery process. This type of knowledge and practice of indigenous people have begun to be recognized in different international conferences related to climate change adaptation and mitigation. In 2021, during the 26th meeting of the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP21, the parties recognized the importance of the role of indigenous people and their scientific knowledge to mitigate climate change and the crisis or loss of biodiversity. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, also stated that recognizing indigenous people's self-determination and other rights and supporting adaptation measures based on indigenous people knowledge is fundamental to reducing climate change risk and achieving effective adaptation. Challenges to the recognition of indigenous people as a stakeholder and subject of rights. Despite the fact that indigenous people have a dual status as victims and agents of transformation in the face of the challenges posed by climate change, neither state nor international organization have sufficiently included their perspective in the design of public policies. In 2017, a report on climate change presented by the former UN Rapporteur for Indigenous People stated that indigenous peoples were being affected by measures taken in the face of climate change, such as renewable energy through the production of biofuels and the construction of hydroelectric dams, which has involved the dispossession of their lands, displacement, and even the murder of their leaders. In my report, Protected Areas and the Right of Indigenous People, published last year, I stated that increasing protected areas alone will not address climate change unless other substantive measures are taken. First, that those causing the climate crisis to change their consumption pattern and reduce carbon emission. Second, indigenous people are included as stakeholders and right holders, recognizing their knowledge and capacity for managing and stewardship the world's biodiversity region. In my report this year on green finance, for example, international funding for private programs and initiatives that promote sustainable development and climate change action, I argue that such resources could have negative impact on indigenous people if their allocation does not take into account a focus on the protection of their rights. To date, climate change funding and official development assistance have not allocated sufficient funds to support indigenous people-led initiatives. Advance the recognitions of their collective land rights, preserve their ways of life in a way that helps balance nature and protect them from encroachment attacks and other violence by third parties. In 2022, both COP26 of the Paris Agreement and COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity made some commitment to advance the protection of indigenous people's rights over their territories. Particularly, COP26, governments and philanthropic organizations pledged $1.7 million to advance the recognition of indigenous people's rights over their territories and protection of tropical rainforests. However, The lack of transparency and reporting and monitoring mechanisms makes evaluating compliance with this commitment difficult. For this reason, in the near future, more attention and action must be taken to promote, protect, and advance Indigenous people's rights in the green finance and conservation framework. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we should move right away to ask Sneha perhaps to introduce the substantive program, and then we'll have, and then Diksha Tiwari will present the cultural program. So please, two of you, take it away.
Thank you, everyone. In understanding that there's been already delays, we will not take as much time. I wanted to acknowledge that this entire event has been conceived led by the students at JSPH. So acknowledging their efforts, I would invite both Diana and Diksha to walk you through the program for the 2 days. Thank you so much.
Pleasant afternoon, everyone. Post lunch, we will have 1 p.m. We have panel 2 of Indigenous Knowledge, Memory and Epistemics, moderated by Professor Shiv Vishwanathan and from JGLS, and the speaker Professor Sabyasachi from Jindal Global Law School, former professor from Jamia Millia Islamia University. Moving on, 4:15 to 5 p.m. current events, sexual violence against women in Manipur. Moderator Professor Dr. Swati Narayan from Jindal School of Public Health. Speakers Miss Evelyn Nyanglenching and Miss Rishika Kongkam, students from Manipur. And 6 to 8 p.m. Cultural event. So from day 2, moving forward to day 2, Thursday, 10 August. The third panel will take place from 9 to 10:30 a.m. Panel 3 under the theme of climate change, planetary health and indigenous voices. We are privileged to have moderator Professor Dr. Sneha Krishnan from Jindal School of Public Health, and speakers Professor Dr. Jadumani Mahanand from Jindal Global Law School, Ms. Suchitra Rath from Ekjut India, and Ms. Sumitra Gagrai from Ekjut India. We have from 10:45 a.m. to 12:15 p.m. panel 5. Panel 4, Adivasi Women's Rights Contemporary. Moderator Professor Dr. Soumya Uma, Center for Women's Rights from Jindal Global Law School. Speakers Ms. Dayamani Barla, independent journalist, Ms. Shamona Khanna, advocate, Supreme Court of India, Professor Govind Kelkar, Jim Dev Center for Research and Innovation, Dr. Namita Wahi, Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. And then we will have lunch 15 p.m. to 1 p.m. And now we will move forward to panel 5, Indigenous Languages and Communication Rights, from 1 to 2:30 p.m. which will be moderated by Professor Dr. Venu Arora from Jindal School of Journalism and Communication. Speakers Ms. Meera Devi Khabar Laharia, Ms. Bhaskar Bhuyan, Brahmaputra Community Radio, which will be online, and Ms. Stella Tamang, representative of Cultural Survival, Ms. A.E. Medgoa Achi, that will be online. We will move forward to panel 6, Conflict, Violence and Impunity, which will start from 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. moderated by Professor Kishale Bhattacharjee, the Dean of JSJC, Journalism and Communication. Speakers Professor Dr. Virginius Kaka, Institute for Human Development, Mr. Yashovardhan Azad, IPS, Ms. Soni Sori, and activists. So that's how we will start with our panels. And then thank you for all your attention and participation. We will look forward for enlightening discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. I just wanted to highlight that washrooms and food will be arranged. So washrooms are just around the corner, both the sides. For lunch, for the speakers, and for the moderators, we have arranged it in rendezvous. There will be tea available just outside. The venue for different panels would change, so I would request you all to check with the students or with the organizers to, if you get lost or if you want to know where to go to. And lastly, I also wanted to highlight for some of the panels, mostly tomorrow, we will have translations who will, students who have offered to summarize from different languages into English for the benefit of the audience. Having said that, I recognize that if anyone needs support in understanding with English to other languages, we will also try and ensure that can be arranged. Thank you so much. Over to Diksha.
Jai Johar, and this is how we greet in our language. Welcome to Jindal Global University, where we are proud to celebrate the International Day of the World's Indigenous People. Today we have the privilege to introduce you to some incredible performers who will captivate your hearts and minds with their unique art forms. The first performance is by Mr. Puran Bhatt and his team, popularly known as Akar Puppet Theatre Group. This talent group hails from Nagaur, a small district in Rajasthan, who carries with them a rich tribal performing art tradition. Akar Puppet Theatre Group presents themes that deal with social awareness such as AIDS, family planning, environment, literacy mission, etc. Led by the renowned international artist Mr. Puran Bhatt, this group has been recognized for their brilliance and dedication to their craft worldwide. In fact, Mr. Bhatt was awarded the prestigious Sangeet Natak Academy Award in 2003. The performance will commence at 6 p.m. at the Performance Art Academy, the same place, where Mr. Bhatt will also educate the audience about the art form before mesmerizing performance. Continuing the journey of the Indigenous cultural celebration, we have two exciting dance events lined up for you on 10th of August. It is remarkable that at Jindal University we have a huge network of Northeast students who will be performing the Bihu dance, an indigenous folk dance from Assam. The dance form is known for its vibrant energy and infectious rhythm, to which we are privileged to witness here tonight. Following the Bihu dance, we have a special performance by DOSA, which is the Delhi Odia Student Association from Delhi University. They will be showcasing the Sambalpuri dance from Western Odisha, which beautifully brings together rituals, customs, spirituality, and folk art forms. Both of these performances will take place at Performing Art Academy from 6 to 8 p.m. We are truly honored to have such talented performers with us, and we hope that you will join us in embracing their artistry and celebrating the diversity and the beauty of the indigenous culture. Thank you for being a part of this special occasion.
So we break for lunch sooner than planned, but we will reconvene at the T2 Global Conference Room after lunch at 1 for our first panel with Dr. Ajay Kumar. Thank you.